Hello everybody. I was looking for the Blender tutorial videos I did last year just to make sure I didn't make any mistakes, everything was still up to date, and there weren't any issues, and surprisingly everything was still very good. You know, it's up to date, there's no problems. There was one exception though, with the masking bit for Blender tutorial 2. It really wasn't as well done as it should have been, and it was lacking a bit of information. I thought I'd take the opportunity to do a video just to address masking in a bit more detail in case anyone's having any issues with it still, and it just add in a little bit more information about mainly the difference between relative and absolute masking. Once you know the difference between these, masking, you'll basically know what the issues are with most of your masking problems. I'm just going to do that in this video, so let's just jump into things here. Before I go into that though, let's just look what I have here. Basically, I made a video of just these color strips underneath in a video format, so I have it as an MKV here. So as you can see, the frames of the video are mimicking the colors you see underneath here. So I just wanted to do this to give you a little graphical representation of what each frame looks like. So if I say there's a keyframe on the markers here, I can, that the keyframe's happening on the orange looking frame versus the, the black one here and the teal one here, without me needing to scrub it back and forth and give you a seizure. Just to review masking really briefly. So you make a mask in the UV image editor here, and then from there you need to apply it to a strip to get it into your timeline here, to get into your video here. So the method I had been showing people and the method I still use, there's other methods to do it. This is the main method you'll use. And just go to modifiers and mask and apply it straight to your strip in question. Go to mask and you can just apply the mask here. Then you have the option of choosing between relative and absolute masking types here. Let me start out by saying that there is no difference between these if you're only doing static masks. If I have a static mask, every single frame of your mask is going to be the exact same thing, and so it doesn't matter if I choose relative or absolute, they're both going to show up the exact same way. The difference between these two manifests itself when you're dealing with masks that have keyframes, so masks that are moving specifically. With the relative one, this behaves the way you might expect it to. It basically mimics the existing keyframe system you're already familiar with. So if I just duplicate this, and let's say I want to, let's go to strip, let's do the replace here. Say I want to just move this with keyframes, for example. So I can put a keyframe on a position here, and move the first marker here, and just move this out, and just keyframe that, and the very last marker, and we'll just keyframe that there, and we just refresh, and sure enough, we have movement via keyframes here. And if I move this, what happens? Well, the keyframes are moving relative to the strip rather than the timeline. So even though I made my keyframes here at this point, so frame 20 in the timeline, the keyframe actually moved itself with the strip. And you can see this in the graph editor. If I can just pull this up, hit home. And as we move this, you can see the keyframes are in fact moving across the timeline with the strip. So the keyframes are relative to the strip itself. And I'll just show you a little quick tip here. If I wanted to actually jump to the position, just to put this back. So I want to jump from this position to that position and not have something like the in-between stuff happening here like it is automatically here. An easy way to do that, instead of doing a keyframe before and maybe after to get that to happen, is just go highlight the keyframes, hit L, okay, not L, what is it? Interpolation T. I keep getting that mixed up. So T, let's go to constant here. And as you can see, that'll automatically do what you otherwise would have gotten if you put a keyframe before and, well, sometimes after a while. So instead of doing like 6 keyframes, it's just like 3 in this case. You cannot do this with masks. You don't have the same functionality with the graph editor as you do with the masking in the UV editor and the dopesheet, which we'll be using in a minute here. So just going back to what we were supposed to be talking about in this video, the relative mask. So it's behaving the same way as we have here. So I move it along. If I apply a mask with a keyframe at the markers here, if I move this out to this point here, it's the same as having the markers themselves move over as well. And we'll see there are a lot of pitfalls with this though. Like if I move things around, depending on how my strip is and whatnot, there's a lot of things to watch out for that might be causing you errors and whatnot. But that's the gist of relative. It just moves with the strip across the timeline. Absolute is a little bit different. So with the absolute one, basically when I apply keyframes, so say I apply a mask with keyframes at the markers again here, basically if I move my strip over to here, for example, well, the mask that shows up when this strip is just based on this final keyframe. So if I do any kind of mask, if I make the mask here, anything to the right of this keyframe is just going to be a constant, right? Well, if I move the entire strip over here, it's just going to be that singular constant. Because with absolute, it basically applies the keyframes relative to the timeline rather than the strip itself. So the keyframes in the mask aren't moving with the strip. They're staying in the position that they were created in the first place. So I move it over here, then just this keyframe is going to be shown for everything to the left of it, etc. To get the changes in between, which is probably what you create the mask for to begin with, you're going to need the strip to actually fall underneath these keyframes. And one of the benefits to this is I can actually move the strip so that the keyframe falls on a different frame, for example. So in this case, at this marker, it's supposed to fall on this cyan frame, but if I moved it over like one, then it would fall on the purple frame. The mask would, the keyframe, not the mask, the keyframe would in this case. So one thing to mention with both of these is that you can actually set up a relative to mimic the properties of the absolute. And you can set up the absolute to mimic the relative in most situations. It is a bit more limited going from absolute to relative versus relative to absolute. Okay, but without further ado, basically what I'm going to do now is run through some examples, and we're going to see the pitfalls of the relative bit and how to work around them. Okay, so let's start out by making a mask here. So just zoom things in a little bit more. And good. So let's make a mask. We'll go to our UV image editor here. We'll apply it to this color strip movie here. As you can see, this is only the length of the color strips as you see down here. There's no more to it than what you see there. And that will come into play, so just keep a note of that. So let's just use the F12 method to get a screenshot in here. And once you shift A, grab a circle, and just blow that out with S, and we'll just make this our mask here. So what we're going to do is make this kind of our base mask, and then at these frames here, I want to have some kind of change occur just at the frame. So just at the teal, just at the black, every other frame I want to look like this. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to apply a keyframe at the very start here, and you're going to see why I do that in a little bit. So just I to apply a keyframe, it applies there, and right before the first change, just I again, and right after the first change, and right before the second change, I, and now we can just go to our points we want to make the changes, and we'll just move a little movement here. So move it to the center, hit I, and for the black, we'll just move it over here, and just hit I again. And once we do that, just hit refresh sequencer to make sure everything shows up properly. And I should scrub here, just look what's going on here. And change, back, change. Okay, great. So now we want to apply this to our strip here. So as mentioned, you would just click on it, go to modifiers, mask, mask, and choose your mask. Ta-da. So I'm going to show the relative first here. So let's just scrub it, and nothing's happening. So we want these two to mimic each other, specifically at these two frames here, and they don't. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to set this up properly first. So to set up a relative mask properly, you want to basically choose the frame that the start of your mask falls on, so 20 in this case, And we're just going to specify that as our start frame under mask settings here. So just N again to get that pan up, N. So 20. And just refresh again, and let's have a look. Ta-da! It matches. Yay! And what we'll see is we just duplicate this over. In fact, it is doing the things that we had expected the relative mask to do. And we look at the very last frame, and sure enough, it's the change on the black once more. Okay, great. So I can move this around my timeline. I could, move it in a bit. I could do whatever I want with it. And it works the way like you'd expect it to with the normal keyframes and strips method that you were so used to with everything else in Blender VSE already. Okay, wonderful. Now let's look at this a bit differently. Say I want to, let's just duplicate this and say, remember how I said my video is only that long to begin with? Well, what if I was editing this video and edit something a bit shorter? Because that's what you do in the video editor, right? You edit things, you make them shorter, you decide, okay, I just want to mask the teal to the black section here. Well, let's move this out and let's do a mask just for this specific section. So remember, it was from the teal to the black, so from here to here pretty much. And our original information is still there, but we're just moving it in. It's the equivalent of doing a soft cut at that point here. And yeah, let's do a mask for this one. So we'll just do new mask, and let's do a circle, ta-da, and do a keyframe at the start. And right before the very last frame, we'll do a keyframe. Then the very last frame, we'll do a change here. And keyframe. Okay, so we want to apply this again as a relative mask. So let's just update our mask to mask 1. And you might expect it to work fine and dandy, right? Well, let's just have a look. Very last frame. No change. What's going on? Oh, we forgot to do the start frame. Okay, let's just input that. Great. And this doesn't match up, does it? It does not. So what's going on here? We did the exact same thing we did over here, but it's basically showing the very last keyframe here. Well, what's happening is because we have this data here, it's actually functioning the same as it was as if I had this brought out and all of its data displayed. So even though the data is not being shown immediately, it's actually taking that into account when it's displaying itself here. So if I bring this out and I look, sure enough, it's offsetting itself, thinking that the original data here is coming into play. So in order to get this to line up properly, I'd have to, tinker around a bit. Well, let's just get it to work again here. So 9. This is 4 in this case. So we get it to work. We want to get these two lined up again at the moment. And they're lined up now here. So again, I need it to line it up to the very start of my movie rather than lining it up to any specific point in the middle. Because even though it was hidden like that, it was still referencing the very start of the movie. So I mean, I could go through this process and always reference the start of the movie to get it set up correctly, and then just, bring it in like that, and then, okay, great, I have my mask. It's just something to be really aware of. Another workaround to this is if, for example, let's find our start position here. If we want to go from cyan to black like this, let's just get rid of our mask for a second here. So what I can do to get rid of this extra information is just meta the strip. And as we can see, it's functioning like this one was. And so we just mimic what we did originally here and apply our mask relative to the start here. So we're on 9 here, so let's just change that to 9. And we'll just preview here. And we need to actually apply the mask. That would be a good idea. And relative. And sure enough, everything is working like it was in the first example here. So we're golden. The very last frame is having to change. We move it around. The very last frame has to change. It's working as intended originally. So that's the main pitfall with relative masks. Let's cover the absolute very quickly here. So let's go back to our original mask and let's make a duplicate of this. And this is a useful thing to know. So we'll just hit the number here. It could be a number like 9 or 5, depending on how many masks I have. It just makes a duplicate of the existing mask for me to apply new properties to. So if I wanted to apply like the deal with the outside of the existing mask, I could just make a duplicate and then just function with the invert command here, which is what I do quite often. So we made a duplicate. This is mask 2. We're just gonna make mask. We're just gonna display it. Remember that applying absolute here and this doesn't make this an absolute mask. It's just a case of making your mask here and then saying I want to actually display it for this strip as being absolute or relative, so absolute in this case. So let's look at this. And to get this set up so it was like the original, what we want to do is basically change this to 0, the start frame for the absolute. Because with absolute, what we're going to do is specify the start frame as the very start of our strip where we want the mask to display. So again, we have 2, and we just hit refresh here, and we just scrub here, and sure enough, it's displaying like the relative one we had at the start, but more importantly, it's matching these two up here. So let's just move this. Actually, let's duplicate this out and see what happens. So with the relative, you know, we expected this to be the very last, it to be the same thing, regardless of where we move in the timeline. With absolute, like I said before, it's just a continuation of the very last strip keyframe, wherever it fell in the timeline, being displayed to the right or to the left, depending on where you are. So in order to get the keyframes to actually show up, you need to have the strip within falling on the keyframe in the specific part of the timeline that the keyframe falls upon. Sorry, I'm getting a bit bogged down by the nomenclature here, but just to show you, so I could change this by moving it over 1. Say I wanted to get the yellow to fall on this keyframe change here. Well, I can just move it over by 1, and ta-da, the yellow now falls there. And so by doing this, originally the cyan fell on this keyframe change, but I moved it over, so now the magenta falls on it, and so and so and so and so. So I can make any color fall on any specific, you know, keyframe or movement that I want by doing this. Okay, great. So some functionality with absolute though is you can actually move these by just changing the start frame here. So if I change this up, you can only go up, just to let you know. And by going up, you basically move things to the left here. So even though if I'm originally on the cyan here, and I move this up by 1, what's going to happen is everything's going to move to the left. So the magenta is going to become the keyframe bearer of that one. So as we see, sure enough, yep, the keyframe, it moved the keyframe over 1, pretty much is what I'm doing here. So with absolute, by changing the start frames, you can think of it as moving the keyframes over to the left. So I can move as many times over to the left as I want, pretty much. But how do you move to the right, you might be asking yourself? Well, to do that, you gotta basically move the keyframes themselves using the dopesheet here. Because here we were just kind of playing with the coordinate systems, and well, it could be the exact same thing, to be honest. I don't know how the actual system does it, but I just think of it as being like that. But anyways, to move them around, let's go to the dope sheet and go to mask and look at our, what was it, mask 2. And we'll just hit home here, zoom in a bit, and just be really careful. You might double tap A thinking you're just grabbing this one, but in reality you're grabbing all of them. So that's something to be aware of. And so I just do box select, grab the keyframes. These are the keyframes that we made here, these little yellow things. Sometimes yellow things don't actually show up here, which might be kind of annoying, but they always show up in the dope sheet here. So if I wanted to mimic the move over to the left one, well, I can literally just move these over to the left. And this was the reason why I do a keyframe at the very start of my mask, just so I always know that here should match up to whatever the starting point of my mask as intended was. So it's just a very easy way for me to remember where things fall relative to each other. So I move it over by 1. I'm basically going to mimic what was happening before, so it should fall on the magenta. And sure enough, the keyframe change does fall on a magenta. So say I want to make it fall on the blue, so I just move it over 1 to the original and 1 over like so. And sure enough, it falls like that. So say I want to mimic the relative style with the absolute, and I have the strip moved all the way over here. Well, of course, it's just going to mimic the very last keyframe change there. Bit. I can just find where I am here and just G and move it all the way over to the specific place. And just refresh again. And as we can see, the middle cyan again. Ta-da! Keyframe change. And very last frame, black, is our keyframe change once again. So as you can see, we basically took the absolute and mimicked the relative, but it's kind of limited with like this functionality anyway, it's going in just one way. But you can get around that with the dope sheet as seen here. And in terms of the relative, you can of course just move things to mimic the absolute at any set location, more or less, I guess. If you wanted to move things over to cover a specific frame for the keyframe, you could just use these again with the relative as we kind of went into before. So I realize this is kind of confusing, and it's just a case of going through, getting the hang of it. In terms of how I tend to do masking lately, or since I've last shown that tutorial video 2.1 anyways, what I would do is, like in this case, we have the, let me go back to, I'll just go back to the relative one, for example, here. So the keyframe change was on here, the teal and the black here. So how would I do this? Well, you have the base, then you have the change here. I would basically just divide things up. Well, first of all, I would decide what bit of my strip, however long or whatever the size was, I divide things up. I isolate just the part that needed to be masked to begin with, right? So if I had a longer strip with more information, I'd do the cut and just isolate the bit. And from there, I would just isolate the different keyframes. So just soft cuts here, for example. And I just isolate them all into static masks, pretty much. So we have one static mask here, one static mask here, one static mask for here, and one for here. And these would be the same because they're the exact same. So I could just use the same masked, whatever number I name it. And then I'll make a different number for this one and a different number for this one, and just, you know, change the number for each part of the strip. And the beauty of this is you don't run into the issues when you're, you know, changing the lengths like I showed you with the relative here. And just, yeah, it's just less confusing. It's a divide and conquer mentality. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do this, like if I'm trying to mask out a character, and it's just a case of a simple transform of, you know, X or Y, in which case using like automatic keyframes and whatnot makes a bit more sense. And what I might do then is actually just render the bit out if I need to manipulate it a lot. Otherwise, just, you know, be aware of, I guess the main thing is just be aware that what might be causing the problem if you run into the problem, because you're always gonna, you know, scrub and know if something goes wrong, right? And just knowing how the system works, and the fact if you know, have a strip that you make the mask for that's relative, and you have extra information here, and you move things around, or, you know, just knowing what can happen pretty much, and then knowing how to problem solve is really the key to masking in Blender VSE. And then from there, deciding what kind of system you want to use to address the issues. So that's pretty much it for this video. I could go over masking in a bit more detail. I'm debating whether to do some actual examples like I did at AMV kind of tutorial 2.5, the AMV one, because I am working on a couple of AMV projects and I do a lot of masking for those. So if you're interested in that, I can maybe just go through some more specific examples, like masking lately. What I do generally, if like I'll just try and show you very briefly. If I'm trying to mask this here, and say it was like a person, for example, so there's like more to it than just you know, doing a specific kind of curve type like we have with this circle here. So if one section was a curve like here, well, typically what I would do, if it doesn't really matter if it's like 1080p like this, but if it's like 720 and like a low resolution, you'll get like pixelization, this grainy kind of choppy kind of bit here, and you're trying to mask that with Bezier curves. Basically, the method I like to do lately, if it's something that shows up anyways, is basically make the curve, if I want to just cover if I want the pink to be in my mask, I would basically make the curve such that the curve gets just the pink and none of the black here. And then from there, I would basically apply a feather, and you gotta change the direction because it's never the right direction, and have the feather get that little excess, little pink here, a little bit of that excess pink. And what this will do is it'll make your mask not look choppy, especially if you're dealing at like lower kind of resolution, like 720, or images that are like 480, 80 or whatever. It's just a really nice way to make sure you don't get choppy kind of masks, especially if you're kind of masking out characters and whatnot. So you would make your Bezier curve so it just covers the good stuff, and then have your mask, your feather be the thing that dips into the black here. So I'm getting a bit of the black, so I wouldn't really want that. So it would be like this probably here, and it's a very nice effect. And you can change the feather again, just scale it with Alt S. Oh, sorry, what is it? Alt S, yeah, Alt S. Scale the feather, and I covered all this stuff in tutorial video 3, the very start, I think, and tutorial video 2. So just review that if you need to. If you're doing like an interior section, it's the exact opposite. So you would basically, with your Bezier curve, cover the very end of the purple, and then you would have your feather be the thing that goes to the good section. So it's like that pretty much, and you would of course invert if need be, and that would be like if you're doing an interior section that of your mask, for example. And the same thing goes with having multiple masks for one object. So say if I needed to mask out eyes for this one here, I would probably do it in I mean, if it's something simple, you could just, you know, do it like that type of thing. But if I'm trying to mask out a specific object with lots of geometry and it changes over time, what I would do is make this a single mask for, you know, that one section. Then wait to the next section, I can just make a little change to it, and then you know, from there make another copy, then make a little change for the next section. And generally what it ends up looking like is I have maybe a couple of different little parts of a couple of masks for a singular static kind of strip here in the end. But it's probably better if I just actually show you some examples. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. I'm going to end here. So thanks very much. I was debating whether to do another tutorial video or not tutorial video for. I just haven't had enough time lately. Well, I have had enough time. I just haven't gotten around to doing it. It's just been kind of difficult to get around. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going to stop talking right now. I'm really tired. This actually took like 10 attempts over 3 days to try and get this, even this little video done. I was debating what was the best way to do it. How should I do this? How should I do that? Should I show examples? Should I do this? Should I do that? And it never got done. I have like 20 versions of the video already, and I'm going to stop talking and end here. So thanks very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again. Bye.